and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, we're going to talk about something you want to talk about, Chris.
Yes, this is a topic that has been niggling at me for years. And so when we were talking about what might we do next, this one came up for me. And what I've realized through my career is that if you think about the way in day-to-day business, people talk about their organizations, frequently they will either describe them as startups or they will describe them as the other one. And often I even hear people saying the phrase, we should be more like a startup.
Yeah.
And I've often felt that was an emotional response, and they're trying to tell you something interesting. I think if most mature businesses acted like a startup, very bad things would happen. What I'm absolutely not trying to say is that startups are bad. What the topic of this episode is about is, I don't even know if this is the right word, the organizational life cycle, as in how do businesses and organizations start, grow, mature, and then what happens next. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more and talk about that.
There's another phrase I've heard bandied about as well, which is scale up. So move from startup,
that's right,
brand new, scale up. We're now at the point where we've got a going concern. Now we need to grow and expand, and we're going to scale up. And then there's incumbency or whatever you want to call it for that point at which you're not any longer a startup or a scale up.
But here's the interesting point. So I agree with you, by the way. I've often been in interviews where people say we're a scale up and we're looking for people. Outside of that initial statement about scale up, startup, or the other thing, have you heard anyone differentiate between those organizations in a meaningful way in terms of how they operate their business, how they recruit, how they move even through those different levels of maturity, as it were?
Only in the way that, as you said, established businesses who recognize that they need to do things differently often talk about wanting to be more like a startup. And in my last few years in the military, on 2 different projects I was involved in, the word startup was used for either new organizations or reinvigorating already established organizations within the military. And they were using the phrase, so in one of them, it was an army organization, and they talked about we are the army startup. Never really explaining exactly what it means.
This is my point. It's so interesting because there are so many of the other topics we've talked about, vision, strategy, tactics, planning, where I think organizations, while we all sort of have talked about over many episodes, could do it better.
Yeah.
There is an institutional sense of what those things are and how you approach those. And yet this one, it feels like a whopping great gap, which, if I put this in a different way, if someone straight out of school joined an organization, you would immediately say, I recognize where they are in their state of maturity.
Yeah.
I understand a process by which they might travel over a number of years. And I even understand how to measure where they are, and I understand how to move them between. So if it was people, you wouldn't blink about this idea of maturing them. If it's an organization, there's a massive gap.
Yeah.
But I'm going to pause this here for a second. By the way, when we get into the meat of this, I'm fascinated to know how the military thinks, because I think this is another case where you could easily say this is about businesses, but I think this is as much about the military as well. Let me set that scene. You could argue the military is one of the most mature businesses in the world.
Yes. Yeah, arguably.
You can't see Gareth's face like, oh, yeah, I see what you mean about that. They've been around for a long time. Fighting is fighting at one level, and they know how to do it. So, but we know that's not true. I want to come back and I want to make this point about how businesses change, because this is I'm going to patent my own framework because every other bugger gets to make their own framework. I want mine. I'm not saying it's any good, but I'm going to do one. And this is this idea of how businesses change and they don't actually understand how they're changing, or at least it's not something that's a clear focus. I used to work for Adobe. Adobe, for those of you, I can't believe any of you don't know who Adobe is, but it is a creative powerhouse. They invented and created Acrobat and PDF. They invented and created Photoshop. And actually, if there is anything you've seen creatively, whether it's a film, television, a print advert, an internet advert, Adobe tools are all over that. And then when you go and talk to most designers, and I spotted this at Adobe, and it was curious to me, they really hate Adobe.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, well, let's talk about why they hate Adobe. And I literally Googled this before I came over tonight and to do the recording. And I found a random forum with someone talking about Adobe software. So I'm going to read through what their comments were, just so you can feel the anger and feel the disappointment. And this isn't isolated. There's lots of people saying this. I've been in this game for 30 plus years. I started with PageMaker and Quark Express. By the way, people don't know this, but this was my world when I was at Adobe. And have used Photoshop before it even had layers and only one undo. So this is a person saying, I have been here for years. I am the grandfather of design. I've owned the software all the way through up until CS5, which I continue to use. But of course, all good things come to an end, and I get sent files to work on the latest versions. When did they become so shit? Laggy, cumbersome, and unintuitive. I was just working on InDesign, he goes on for a bit, and it ends off with, everything I now move the mouse over pops up, try this now, animated GIF, download this update. Fuck me. I just want to get in, do the work, get out and get paid. Oh, surely it can't be that bad. Let's try one of the new neural filters. What? Can't find a face? It's a fucking headshot. There is an angry person.
Yeah.
But let's take this back. So you might say, oh, well, Chris, Adobe, those idiots. Everyone hates Microsoft. Oddly, slightly less so. I don't know why. I'd be pretty willing to bet that if you actually talk to people at Google, most people don't like Google either. Why is that? In the case of Adobe, the person that was writing this rather angry note, he wouldn't have a business. The creative world, billions of dollars that people have earned for their small businesses have come through Adobe. Likewise, Microsoft, likewise, Google.
Yeah.
How is it that people go from you created a career for me through to I hate you? And what I realized is that in the world of software, I'm going to talk very specifically about software, I think there is a life cycle that people miss and people don't understand. I'm not saying this is a good life cycle or a bad life cycle, but this is a life cycle. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the airing of the Kitchener Software Business Life Cycle.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, you should be that excited.
Has it got a curve?
It's sure. It would have a curve in a book. It would have a curve.
Because once you have a curve, you've made it.
You'd have made it. Anyway, let's start with the first one. I'm going to call this. By the way, Gareth is laughing at me because he didn't know I was going to do this. And it really isn't as good as I've made it out to be. There are 5 stages. Number 1, discovery. A company, a person has an idea, writes some software, and is looking for someone who will pay me for that. So you're trying to figure it out. It's a great stage. It's nerve-wracking, but it's exciting. The next stage is what I'll call customer fit. You find someone who's willing to pay some money for the thing you have just built. You are talking closer to them. You're actually evolving the products to meet their needs. And there's so few of them, you're kind of working really closely, because every time they see your software, they say, well, if you built that, that would be even better. And each time you do it, maybe they pay you a bit more money. Maybe they're more excited. But this is something you see in this sort of position of a company, particularly a software company, is they are really exciting and delighting customers. They know you are the center of their world. So customer fit is a great time for them.
Yeah.
They absolutely love it. And then one day you come to them and you say, you need to move to stage 3, although you don't call it that. And you say, I realize that we have built stuff that was just for you, but you know what? You have to understand, I need to find hundreds of you for my business to grow and be healthy. So I'm going from customer fit to market fit. And what I'm going to do is I'm now going to start to build out my feature set based on a broader set of customers,
Yeah.
which is great. But my connection with you, my first few special customers, is diminishing a little bit. There's some things you might want us to do, and we say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. We're doing something else. Look,
Yeah.
we've built this amazing new thing, and they say, yeah, I don't want that amazing new thing. But we're in a good place. You know, if you get to market
Yeah.
fit, you're doing well, your customers have got some software they love. And by the way, this literally is the world of Adobe and Microsoft and others. Then you get to the tricky bit. You get to market maturity and dissatisfaction. All of a sudden, the business is saying, we need to grow. We need to find the next big thing. Maybe we've built one piece of software. Maybe we need to build another piece of software. Or we've built one set of features. We have to build a different set of features. And that's great. But now all of a sudden, your core customer, the initial set of customers, and maybe even some of the people in your market are starting to say, yeah, but these aren't my features anymore. You know, when I do this, and you've now started to spend some of your effort and focus doing other things. Okay, generally people are okay with that, but now they're saying, but you are going to keep innovating for the things I care about, aren't you? And even more, you're going to fix the bugs right, because as software grows, bugs grow, more and more errors go into the system. And so the customer says, look, I understand that you're going in another direction, but our covenant, the agreement we have between us, where I pay you monthly for your software, is I kind of want you to build some new features for me. Maybe that'll happen, maybe not. But you have to fix the bugs right. And actually, what you find is the business's needs and the customer's needs start to diverge.
Yeah.
And as that customer base goes larger and larger and larger, actually what the customer wants and what the business wants diverges more and more. And going back to that point, it can't be that bad. When did they become so shit, laggy, cumbersome, and unintuitive? Adobe are in that market maturity and dissatisfaction. And at that point, for Adobe, the game is I have to keep my customers happy enough.
Yeah.
But I have to go and grow my business because my investors want more money. My shareholders want more money. So number 4 is a really difficult point. And I would argue Microsoft, Google, Adobe, and probably a ton of other software companies you have bought software from, they're at that point, market maturity and dissatisfaction. So that's really interesting. You'd say sort of Adobe is Adobe. I've just described the beginnings of a model that says actually they're behaving in different ways.
Yeah.
The customer's behavior is slowly diverging. And if you do it really wrong, you get to stage number 5. Customer anger, ripe for replacement.
Yeah.
So going back to that comment about I've been in this game 30 years. I started with PageMaker and Quark Express. When I started working for Adobe, Quark Express had 90% of market share. If you were doing desktop design and you weren't using Quark Express, you weren't in the game. Quark Express got to this point of market maturity and dissatisfaction. And what did Adobe do? Adobe said, don't you worry, Mr. Customer. We're going to build this thing that has all the features that you had in Quark, a bunch of new features you had never imagined. You know how they only added 1 or 2 features and they charge you loads and loads more each time? We're going to add a ton of features and it's not going to be as expensive. And so all of a sudden, when you get to that customer anger ripe for replacement stage, that's where customers lose patience. There's room for a new entrant, and customers are willing to bet on a new horse,
Yeah.
even if that horse isn't as good as the old horse they were on. Now, this isn't, as it were, the core topic of today's podcast, but what was really interesting to me as I experienced this, not just in Adobe, but I witnessed in other organizations and then in companies I'd worked in, understanding where you are is really important.
Yeah, well, I think you've laid out the context of incumbency, which sets the context for why startups feel like there's an edge. Because there are very few organizations, and there are very few moments in history where actual, genuine, new blue sky or blue water or whatever you want to call it, sort of innovation brings something new to the market. That does happen, but typically, actually, startups refine a model that already exists better. And sort of going through that, it struck me that there's two aspects of this. The software industry that you're talking about is an industry that thrives on network effects. So the more people that use the software, the more useful that software becomes. And that's even more the case now that we are all connected almost permanently on the internet. So the choice of moving to use something else isn't always owned by the user, because the user and the customer aren't always the same. And also, if everybody else is using it, it might just be too difficult. So there's that network effect. And then there's the additional move towards subscription services that we're all kind of getting more and more used to now. And what that creates is a barrier to going elsewhere. So if you are a software developer, a hardware developer, if you're Samsung or Apple or Dell or whoever, actually the difficulty now of moving to use a new application or a new piece of hardware is significant. It takes a lot of effort, and that's the same for other services. And it's interesting when you talk about this point where you're at stage 4, verging on stage 5, where people are getting angry, that there is a point at which, presumably, it is in the interest of the business to not really worry about people being angry, as long as they're not so angry that they go above that threshold to move on. And I think this explains perhaps why energy companies' complaints lines are so shit.
Yes, because what are you going to do? But here's a really, really critical point about this. So what you've talked about, well, actually, let me go back. The first statement is, as a business, this is something businesses need to talk about.
Yep.
And I'm talking software for the moment. We still haven't got to the main course, by the way, of the sort of, we're talking about something quite localized software, but we'll come back to a broader business. But the first thing is that a business needs to actively talk about and think about this. I don't remember, and as towards the end of my time, I was a little bit more senior at Adobe, but I don't remember anyone really talking about this. People talked about angry customers.
Yeah.
There were periodic, we need to fix more bugs, but actually no one ever sat down and thought about it as a life cycle. The next thing is, you are right, it is an exercise, and it is I think actually it's a very difficult line to move, which is, are we here to build a business, or are we here just to make customers happy?
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into the sort of the ethics of that, but
I think there is an interesting point there, which is, as you talked about, as you go from, was it stage 2 to stage 3, where you start to move away from
was this of the Kitchener model of software maturity?
It was.
Brackets 2024.
As you move away from bespoke solutions to individual people's problems to becoming more generic,
yeah,
in that need to grow more of a market share, you become more generic. As a result,
yes,
people that are already using your software are going to, by default, find that there is functionality that they don't need,
well,
or functionality that they had that is no longer there.
A different way of saying it is, the value growth that they originally saw with the product tails off.
Yeah.
And so,
there is the Kitchener curve.
But I'm still the Kitchener cliff. I like that.
Kitchener
That's very
curve.
good. Kitchener curve. It's not a cliff;
Yeah.
it's going to fall off. But we'll come to the cliff in a minute. So the value that is being provided by your service, even though you're charging the same amount each month, where the customer feels bad is, I'm not getting the same value I got. You didn't do anything new for me last month.
But it raises another question, which is this need for growth. Is there a need for growth?
Yes.
Or is this a self-induced pressure that we have created? Because actually, if you are a profit-making organization, you have a number of employees, and you provide a service that people are happy with, and you maintain and retain the skills to continue to provide that service, then why do you need to grow?
Well, I'm hoping we've got a number of CFOs and CEOs listening who right now are weeping, because if you are a company that is owned by other people or you have other shareholders,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the default answer is, sorry, I didn't invest in this business to get no returns. I expect to see more returns. Now, again, I'll leave this for a different episode where we talk about the wisdom and the ethics of this. But the reality is businesses are grown with a goal to grow profits.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd go invest somewhere else. But I just want to come back.
Or either grow profits or grow potential for acquisition. And they're two subtly different things.
That's correct.
But I think they both have an impact on the customer quality or customer sort of
the way you could describe that is
return.
The value of a business is represented by a number of different factors, one of which is revenue.
Yeah.
One of which is customer satisfaction, because this is another thing which I learned after
one of
many
which
years,
is profit, one of which is growth,
customer retention,
EBITDA,
customer satisfaction. So all of those
lots of things.
But so I just want to go back a little bit, because I wanted to finish a thought you'd made, which is businesses become very good at retaining customers. And that's actually a very healthy statement to make, but it hides doing just enough to keep the customer happy so I can use the money I might otherwise have spent on something else that will be valuable for other people, let's say, or for a different kind of people. I think businesses get very good. Microsoft is king of that. You know, Word.
Yeah.
Nothing interesting new in Word, thank you very much. Well, no, we've got AI. Yeah, I don't need AI. Well, anyway, Microsoft Word is great. This works great until you have the Kodak moment.
Yeah.
Now, you get large incumbents who are, I would argue, extraordinarily unusual, like Microsoft, where that is unlikely to happen. They have such a large overarching network effect and a diversifying effect that isn't going to happen. But Kodak, and we seem to keep coming back to Kodak, and I realize it's a real cliche, but Kodak is a really good example of, if you said to someone else, somebody is going to destroy your business, they would have laughed and said no. And then for different reasons, it wasn't customer dissatisfaction per se. It was that the value they were bringing with their film cameras
was suddenly stripped away.
Was suddenly no longer as great as this other new. You mean I don't have to buy film? I'd have to go down to the
maybe because
people would go to the chemist,
I know,
take their films on holiday, and now you look at them and go, why would I do that? They're all on my phone.
Maybe because we've done Kodak to death, we should do Nokia.
Yeah, Nokia or BlackBerry. Perfect example. In fact, BlackBerry, I think, well, both of them are brilliant examples, which was, these were the darlings. These were the incumbents. These were well, I've got a new operating system with a little bit of a twiddle to it. And all of a sudden, people disrupted them. This is not about disruption. You know, disruption was one of the reasons. This is about, if the BlackBerry customer and the Nokia customer were absolutely delighted with everything that organization had done, and every time there's a new version of the phone, something amazing came out, then they wouldn't have changed. But it turns out that some guy called Steve Jobs turned up on a stage one day and said, it's a phone, it's a music device, and it's the internet, and people went, oh, I'll have that. Anyway, the point there, and we should move on because I know we're coming up to a break, is, while that, I actually think that's really interesting, and in the software world particularly, how do you manage that divergence of interests and value? The point really I was trying to make with that half an hour diversion was, every business has these life cycles. And if you don't understand these life cycles, you are going to have a Nokia moment. And even not just that, this is not just about saving the business. This is about each step of the way, and we'll come on in a minute to look at a different framework more broadly about a business. We'll go back to the startup, scale up, maturity. At each step of the way, I would argue you need a different kind of business. And this was something which when I was when I've been hired by other companies, and I've actually even done a bit of research as I was being interviewed, what I would read back to them often is, you haven't had one company, you've had multiple companies. And they look at me and say, what are you talking about? That's crazy. I say, no, I can literally point at the different stages. There was the kitchen counter stage where the payroll was done in an Excel spreadsheet. There was another stage where you said, we better hire someone in HR because otherwise we've got a problem. There was, well, we better formalize training. We better formalize processes. But what I found actually in almost every organization I've been in, everyone has talked about the tactical changes. No one has ever stood back and said, well, hang on a minute. If we're hiring a head of HR for the first time, because we recognize there are some things our business needs, actually, is this a sign we're entering a different phase? What are the other things we need to be starting to think about? So rather than wait for the problem to appear or the pressure to appear, people aren't thinking differently. And just if people think, oh, this sounds like a load of chatting and nonsense when we're trying to grow a business, let me give you another really good, simple example. The founder. I love this. Founders of businesses are considered gods. Everyone, founder. Yeah. I can guarantee you, I'm going to do this so I don't get myself in trouble. At least 50%. The number is much higher, by the way. After X years, when the business is successful, the founder is a big, fat pain in the ass for the business. Because while the business is trying to become professionalized and grow, you've got this guy or girl in the corner going, well, I could have done that in 2 weeks. So, well, I don't agree with that.
There's two reasons for this. One is coming up with a new idea is cooler than being a competent administrator.
Totally.
So the person who runs a successful going concern has a very different skill set to the person who creates a new idea, probably in their garage while living with their parents, doing the hard yards to bring that.
Now you're being insulted to founders now, not me. I love founders.
But they bring it to market and they are the innovator, and that's cool. Whereas the person who takes a going concern and grows it and scales it, they're administrative, they're good at management, boring, but very different skill sets.
Exactly.
The second thing is to be an innovator, to be a founder, not all, I'm tarring a lot of people with a big brush here, but you have to have a collection of traits around two things. One, the confidence in your own ideas to take it forward. And before that, the creativity to have come up with an idea or grabbed hold of an idea and run with it. To be a administrative bureaucrat who can run a medium to large size enterprise efficiently and grow it, you need a whole load of different skills. And I read an article, and I can't remember what it was called or who wrote it, but it effectively argued for the fact that you need artistic, creative types to found companies, and then relatively quickly, as they move from the startup to the scale-up stage, you need to hand it over to engineers. Now, it might be that you get creative engineers and they can do the whole thing. But typically, unless you are Dyson, for example, who is a creative, confident, innovative engineer, typically you're going to have somebody who is an artistic type, got flair, they've got style, they've got confidence, they sell an idea, but they're probably not the best person to pull together an organizational structure, to look at the training policy, the HR, to recognize that they need a training policy.
So perhaps you're implying that you might not want someone who was the person that wrangles the organization and gets a process in place to be there right at the beginning. In other words, I think you're doing a beautiful job of proving my point is there are these different phases.
Absolutely.
And at different phases, there is different organizational principles, different leadership principles, all these kinds of things. Now, what you've done as well is you've almost I mean, I'm cheating here a little bit. You've almost proved my point. Actually, the change from startup to the next phase is reasonably well understood. Often you will find people saying, in fact, you'll find a lot of founders going, I am no good at this. I don't even enjoy this.
Yeah.
We need to start getting people in. So in fact, what you'll often find is, I've seen this quite a lot, founders who are sort of typically in the software world engineers as well, or not always, but often, they then say, I've reached a point where I'm no longer enjoying or want to do the CEO role. I actually want to go back to being an engineer where I can be creative and have a little special role here. So actually the founders are often the ones that identify that change has come. Also, investors, they're very, very good. The investors come in and say, there's a fantastic idea here, but I'm looking at the business. It needs that change. So the move between startup and the next level is pretty well understood. I never hear anything after that.
After that, yeah.
After that's nothing. And you would imagine Nokia and BlackBerry and Kodak would have sat in a room and said, guys, where are we in our stage? Of course they didn't. And then one day and I bet what they did was they started reacting to this idea of, oh God, our lunch is being eaten by this other company. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Quick, let's do this tactical thing. And we'll talk about it later. But anyway, the point being is, I think there is a huge amount here. In a couple of episodes ago, we talked about Frankenstein's leader. We talked about these different traits. I think this is a really interesting way of applying that by saying, if you purely think about a leader, and we're going to talk not just about leader, but organizations and how they behave, you want different leaders with different traits at different times. And we don't think about that.
Yeah.
People very rarely, when I've been involved in getting a job, say, we're here in the maturity. We need you to be this.
Yeah.
But we also need someone who can then evolve into this next thing. They don't do that.
So it's really interesting that in the military, and I think we've alluded to, if not outright discussed it in the past, we have a military that is preparing for, training for, doing capability development for future operations, future war. And then you have a military that is in war, on operations, war fighting. And they're the same leaders. And in times of war, you need different skills. And there are lots of historical examples of where very, very good peacetime leaders have been found wanting, but also pretty average, if not downright terrible peacetime leaders have found their niche in wartime.
I'm going to stop us there because that is the perfect segue of what I wanted to do next. Because I would love to come back after the break, and I would love for us to poke around in the military and understand this concept of maturity, or different, I'm going to say different types. That's the wrong word. Let's stick with maturity. That there are different in business. I want to poke around that with the military, because I think I said half an hour ago, you could argue the military is one of the oldest organizations in the world. I suspect it is both one of the oldest organizations in the world, but it's also in many ways young and startup. In fact, I think it's going through this process as well. I'd love to sort of poke you on that, see what you think. We will be right back after the break. See you in a second. Okay, I thought about this. I mean, obviously, you can tell I sort of stand in the shower and think about these things. It's clear that businesses have these different maturity levels, and what we'll do, we might not even make it in this episode. Maybe we'll have to go to a second episode. You can talk about what these different maturity levels are and what impact that has on a business and how you might think about it. But I wanted to go back and talk about the military. Gareth, you mentioned that you have been involved in units that are considered startup, and clearly I'm going to preempt this. Clearly, Gareth, you are not going to talk about what those units are or what they do, but I can, as in, because I don't know. I would imagine the British military cyber warfare is relatively new, and therefore there was a period it was new. I would imagine there is a component around the space. I would imagine there's all sorts of things like that, which they are startups by dint of there was a point at which no one ever did anything like this.
Yeah.
How does the military think about that? Does it recognize that? Do people walk around going, we're startups, and then move on and do all the same crappy old stuff they've done before? Or do they actually say, well, we better get this type of person in? All the rules that we'd written, the standing orders don't apply.
Yeah, really interesting because I've seen it done both ways. So the military is one of these paradoxical organizations where, as you say, age old, one of the oldest organizations. The British Armed Forces, goes back millennia.
1971. Oh, earlier than that. Okay.
Yeah, the pedigree of the army is about 600 years old in its current sort of recognizable form. The navy is probably over 1,000 years old.
Senior service, don't forget that.
Very much so. The RAF not so much so. But at one point they were a startup.
Nicely done, by the way.
Well, I mean it's not their fault, but yeah.
Say that.
We are going to Cranwell very soon.
We are going to
So
Cranwell.
we need to be
definitely
careful.
have to
We need to
stop.
be careful.
We love our RAF colleagues.
We do. So on one hand, age old, it's an evolution. Things that we know we talk about the nature and the character of warfare and the idea that, and this goes back to our old friend Carl von Clausewitz, who described the nature of warfare as unchanging. The nature of warfare is a clash of wills. It is a human clash of identities, of will, of the use of force to change another group of people's ideological position, either by breaking their will or by convincing them that it is not in their interest to put up a fight. The character of conflict, of course, constantly changes, and we're seeing this at the moment, perhaps more viscerally than we have certainly at any other point in my lifetime, with the innovations that we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the changes that commercial off-the-shelf drones and the Internet of Things are creating, the challenges and dilemmas that's creating to frontline soldiers.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you agree. You could rightly argue that kind of thing, drone warfare, is a startup bubble within the military.
Yeah,
and I'm sure
absolutely.
within the British military as well.
So what you end up with is this sort of old guard who say there's nothing new under the sun.
Tanks.
Yeah,
All tanks.
This is just new technology. The nature of conflict doesn't change, and therefore, let's just apply our thinking and bring in this new technology. So quite often, new technology is brought in, and this isn't a military-only problem. We saw this with electric generators being brought into factories, and they were used in the same way that steam turbines were. So you had one steam turbine that ran lots of machines. They did that initially with electric generators, and it took them a while to recognise that you could have an electric generator for each machine.
Yeah.
And that was a lot more efficient. And the military is kind of the same. So you bring in these new technologies, and the tank, for example, in the First World War, was brought in, and it becomes a surrogate for the horse. Hence why most, like certainly in the British military, but a lot of Western militaries talk about the armoured forces that drive tanks as the cavalry, because they literally replaced the horse. And so you see this sort of evolution of bringing new ideas in. And then there are clearly different approaches where people take a startup approach. And we talked about David Sterling and Paddy Mayne and their rebellious approach to building a new capability in the deserts of North Africa. But again, time and time again, you see people bucking against the system because they say, no, this is a new way of doing things. This is different, and we need a different approach. And I've been in sort of organisations that have described themselves as the army startup or a startup within defense. And what they mean by that is we need a different way of thinking to the incumbent current way of thinking. And I think that gets to the point that you made earlier, that once you're established, once you've got a client base, once you are successful, there's a tendency to create these cultures where change is something to be feared. Change is often inefficient, and there is also, for a variety of cultural reasons, you end up with the sort of groupthink where actually it stifles those innovations. And so by separating yourself out and saying we are different, we are the army startup, it gives you the freedom to do things differently.
But it brings the risk that you then say we're special, which you've heard me say in the past.
Absolutely.
I get very nervous about special. So I want to give another example. We've talked about the SAS quite a lot, and I think they are really useful. There's a story in the Second World War of the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. By the
Yep.
way, there are some excellent books. There's one by Giles Milton, very, very good. We should start up a list of books that we've
We
read,
should, yeah.
because I think people would enjoy that. And in it, he talks about how Winston Churchill at the beginning of the Second World War said that he wanted to set Europe ablaze.
Yeah.
He said we must fight dirty. And so he went off and he empowered a number of people to go away and do things that were not considered gentlemanly by the military. And there's a really interesting example of some chaps in what was called Winston Churchill's toy shop, where, and I think this is I'm going to say 9, but I'm going to probably get this wrong. It was one of the military intelligence sections where a chap called Stuart McRae.
MI9 was
That
supporting
the escape and evasion?
Yeah.
It was another MI.
Right.
Anyway, Stuart McRae and Cecil Clarke developed the limpet mine.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic book and a fantastic story where the people who invented these weapons, one of them was a caravan maker. He invented caravans, and you're not going to believe this was considered a bit odd by everyone. And the story goes that they were told we need an explosive device that will attach to a ship, can go underwater, and reliably blows up at a certain time. And so they I think they figured this out in a couple of weeks. So limpet mines, this sounds odd. The idea that you'd have a magnetic mine that would stick to a ship and blow it up had not been invented before. And an example, a problem they had was, how do you come up with a reliable fuse? And there were fuses at the beginning of the Second World War, but I believe they were mercury fuses, and they were considered not reliable. In other words, you
chemical reactions.
It was chemical reactions, and the chemical reactions were such that they weren't reliable.
Or you had a clockwork timer,
or a clockwork, and
which wouldn't work.
All of these wouldn't work. Yeah. So the first thing this chap did was he went out and bought all the condoms he could find, because he thought, well, I'll just put them in condoms, that'll keep them dry. And the second thing he said was, how on earth am I going to come up out of nowhere with a reliable timer? And his kids turned up and said, hello, Dad. What are you eating? Aniseed balls. That's interesting. They seem to melt at a pretty regular level. And he went away, went to Woolworths, bought a bag of aniseed balls, and discovered if you put an aniseed ball in water, it dissolves at a
very
highly regular rate. And so the first limpet mines took all of the aniseed balls he could buy from Woolworths and all of the condoms he could buy, and that was about. Now, why have I told you that story? He was not in the military. They were given money to just go do whatever they wanted. He didn't go and talk to the people in the military with fuses. He invented himself. That, to me, is about as close to a startup and a whole different approach.
So I think what's really interesting, and I've read that book and I wholeheartedly agree.
Great book. It's a great book.
What's interesting about that is if you had given a regular military unit the idea of go away and work on these mines, they wouldn't have done that. And there's 2 reasons why. One, they would have been constrained in their thinking by everything around them, by the way things are done, by what is deemed acceptable. And 2, the idea of presenting something as ridiculous and as simple
As an
as an
anesthetic
anarchy
condom.
ball,
Yeah.
even if somebody had have thought of the idea, the chances are they wouldn't have had the confidence within a very confined military culture. They wouldn't have had the confidence to present that idea. So I think there is value, but you made the point earlier about the idea of once you call yourself a startup, it gives you the ability to break the mold, do things differently, but it comes with the risk of being considered special, and therefore the rules don't apply to me. And this is where the balance really lies. So the organization I was in, I saw some brilliant, brilliant innovation. Brilliant people, don't understand the military. They were, from a completely different walk of life, brought in to provide advice and guidance and ideas. And they said, why don't you do it like this? And suddenly, all of us, very traditional military types all went, oh, fuck yeah. What? Why didn't we think of that? It's really obvious now, but it took somebody from a different perspective. But there were other bits of the same organization that just did things differently because it was different. And there was a point where I ended up being really frustrated with the fact that a particular group of people weren't really delivering any output, but they were doing things like demanding that people didn't wear uniform because it constrained our thinking. Okay, cool, I get that. Right, we don't necessarily have to wear uniform. Sitting on chairs behind desks, it's all very conformist. Can we get some bean bags? Okay, we can get some bean bags.
All of a sudden, it feels like you're getting away from the goal here.
We want to be able to put ideas up on the walls. Can we put wood chip on the walls? Okay, yeah, we can do these things. Absolutely. And I get the argument that you're constrained, but currently you're not actually doing any of the thinking and being constrained. You're just spending all of your effort thinking about how you can look different. And it struck me, and it became very apparent actually, that there were bits of the organization working as hard as they could to solve problems in a very creative and different way. And then there were bits of the organization spending all of their efforts and energies in how can we look as different as we can.
This word special, you've heard me say over multiple episodes. If anyone ever tells me that they're special, it sets my alarm off.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the example of the limpet mine.
Yeah.
These guys were unconventional. In fact, when they built the limpet mine, they went to friends and people they knew who had built bits for caravans, and they got them to start building the limpet mines. But by the end of the war, they had built 10 million limpet mines or something ridiculous. I'm sure the number's wrong, but it was an enormous amount. So at that, there was a point at which they had to shift from elements of the startup thinking into a scale up and into a mature business.
Yeah.
So here's my $1 million question. I was thinking before we came into this conversation, I would say, tell me how the military thinks about startups and does this. And not only is it maybe not a very satisfying conversation, but actually I'm hoping if you've experienced this, you probably shouldn't tell us because it's different things. But here's something which I can ask because I think it brings the business world and the military world back together. This is good because I know what your answer is going to be. Does the military have a doctrine for how it tackles what we have just described as startup problems?
No.
I knew that was going to be the answer. Because isn't this interesting? What we rely on is the fact that some smart person says, off my own back, and because I'm smart enough, I am identifying that the way we've dealt with this problem, I am going to put us into a startup mode. It was Winston Churchill who said, wow, Ministry of Ungentlemen. He did that. He didn't read a book that said when these things happen.
In fairness, and in sort of defense of the military system, there are organizations that have been developed particularly to looking at new technologies, and that's
probably close. But even then, I mean, the look you gave me when you said no captured it, which was even that I would argue, listen, most businesses have a sense of research and development.
Yeah.
And so you've just described research and development people.
Yeah. Okay.
But this idea of, the reason why I asked about doctrine was, wouldn't you expect there's a doctrine for how the military does what it does and grows and builds and thinks, and you would think there was a doctrine that says, right, we are looking for these moments, and when these moments occur, this is, if you've never done it before, this is how you get started. This is, you know what? The doctrine is, when these 5 things are met, we will create a new little unit. And the new little unit, either we don't make any rules for them, or we give them a bunch of money, or whatever it might be. And again, what I'm not trying to say is the organized, mature part of the organization decides how this startup behaves. But just that idea of, this is maybe a great sort of way to finish this point, which is, in both business world and the military, you are relying that one person wakes up one morning and says, wait a minute, we are not where we were yesterday, and we now need to think differently and do something differently. Wow, that sounds really risky. Like, if you are fighting a war, you do not want to have to hope that someone wakes up and thinks about that. You want people not thinking about it all the time. It's not the biggest thing you do, but you want to prepare for these things. You want to hire people for this. You want to say, do you know what? We've got a couple of officers out of 100. We've got a couple of weirdos who won't fit anywhere else. And we keep them on staff because one day we're going to need that weirdo. Okay, we probably can't do that very much in the military, but that is so interesting. And I don't see that in the civilian world. No one has ever said, here's a playbook for us to, once a year, ask where we are. So, ask, do we need to change?
Interestingly, there's a guy called John Cotter. Have you ever heard of John Cotter?
The name rings a bell, but I don't know.
He's one of those relatively famous authors, management consultants. And he talks in a book called Accelerate, which is very, very good, about this particular challenge, about how do you create growth? How do you create development? How do you break the mold without throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Does he identify when you have to break the mold?
So,
because I think that's my stage 1, which is the stage 2. I think there is enough people who've talked about the, now we know we need to break the mold.
Yeah.
I think the absence is the, when do we need to break the mold?
Yeah, yes, he does. And one of the things he talks about is having what he describes as a dual operating system, which is, and I'm not going to do it any justice at all in the couple of minutes I'm going to talk about it. The book goes into a lot of detail, but effectively it's this idea of, you have your bureaucracy, your hierarchy that allows the organization to run, that allows people to have policy, stick to policy, to have structure and organization that enables day-to-day efficiencies of practice. But if that's all you have, then you also run the risk of stifling innovation, pushing ideas that are fringe further out to the edges so that they're not confident enough to be picked up and run with. And so he talks about then having this dual operating system where, parallel to this bureaucratic, technocratic, procedural process that makes everything run on rails and keeps everybody in line with the way we do things, you have a separate operating system where your radical thinkers, your creatives, are given the freedom to explore new ideas. But what's interesting about doing that is, by having this dual operating system, you have feedback mechanisms where radical thinkers, creatives, are given the space to understand what's happening, but also given the confidence to provide feedback, and so they can tell you when you need to change.
Well,
or certainly earlier.
I was about to say, I'm going to poke on that a bit, because, and I haven't read the book, and so I apologize. He probably does talk about this, but what you've just said is, we run a dual operating system, one which is a more, for want of a better word, startup like, and one is a more mature.
No,
but the thing here, I guess I'm really focused on, I've been beating the death out of this, which is, the business's sense of where they are and what they need to be doing.
So what this isn't is, this is not the skunk works out in the sticks, given a bit of budget and freedom to do stuff, to go and innovate and create and be weird, whilst everybody gets on with day-to-day business over here. This is a dual operating system for the same organization.
Yeah, no,
So
agreed.
it's feedback in, and what it
I'm
does,
still.
what it genuinely does is it feeds into the organization to give them, whether you listen to it or not, as the CEO, the CFO, you know, it's up to you. But what it gives you is the data points to say there are red flags here. There are indications that customer satisfaction is decreasing.
Okay,
The value,
if that's how, because I guess what we're really talking about,
and here are some quick wins.
Well, before we get to the quick wins though, I guess what I'm really talking about is, what are the indicators that tell you where you are?
Yeah.
And for the context we are in now, what do we need to do, and how, and what does that mean? Oh,
Yeah.
we're at stage 4, so we need to think about this.
So I really like
your
model, because it gives you a framework from which to evaluate and go, where.
We'll come back. Look, we've run out of time today, but what we'll do, maybe this sets us up really nicely to come back, because actually there is a much clearer set of stages. And the first example I gave was sort of a little example of a different life cycle.
Yeah.
This one is very much about startup and goes beyond there. And what it talks about is the characteristics, what the focus of the business is, and what I think is really interesting, because I think it starts to tell you where you are, what the challenges are.
Yeah.
If you can identify those challenges to some degree, that tells you where. I'd like to do that. And then, just as an advert for the next session, something I hadn't come across, which is the Griner, it might be Greener, but I think it's Griner Growth Model, developed by Larry Griner in 1972. But this talks about a different way of thinking about the same thing, where he talks about phases of growth in a business, but you'll hear me talk about it a different way. So you're in a business right now. If you're in the military, what stage are you at? Is your unit, are you just about to find out that you need to do something you've never done before? And how is the military ensuring you have the right people, the right process, and right process might mean none. And in the business world, even more so, because there's so much more you get from this. Has anyone in your business sat down and articulated intelligently where your business is and what that means? And I say intelligently because I know everyone's going to say, well, we know we're a scale up. Yeah, but that's where it ends.
Yeah.
People say, oh, we're a scale up.
Well, I think part of the challenge here,
we're slightly less cool than startup.
Yeah.
Is what they often mean.
Part of the challenge here as well is that you see the failures, the Kodaks, the Nokias, the Blackberries, and in hindsight, you say, God, they should have seen it coming. But the reality is, the majority of the time, you are not in that failure point.
And I think my hypothesis is the tactical activities that people undertake without you knowing are your efforts to take you to the next level.
Yeah.
So you wake up one day and say, oh, we've got people leaving because they're not getting trained or they're not getting looked after.
Yeah.
We need an head of HR. Let's do that. But that's a tactical maneuver.
It is, but
rather than understanding it.
This comes back to John Cotter's kind of dual operating model. But when you talk about a military unit, straight away I'm thinking about literally what we call unit size, so battle group level, battalions, regiments. The challenge at the moment isn't how do you change. The challenge is how do you know which bits to change and which bits to keep. And so if you're the CEO of the commanding officer of a battle group, or on the staff of a battle group, or a company commander, or a corporal, or a soldier, of course, you are going to be now particularly worried about what do one-way attack drones mean to me? What do loitering munitions mean to the way I operate? What do the innovations and the new technologies we're seeing in Ukraine mean to the way I operate? What it doesn't mean is we've got to start again blank canvas. And this is the challenge, I think, that all businesses have.
What there is change.
Where are we?
Where are we? And what kind of change do we need to say stop? we need to invent brand new ways of doing this, or do we need to simply evolve what we were doing?
Yeah.
Is the leader of my unit the right person to solve this problem?
So I think,
or do I need a different person who's going to say tanks are not just horses?
let's get into the weed of this next week, and sort of bring this to a close now. But I would finish by saying, very rarely is throwing everything out.
I agree.
Complete revolution.
I agree.
The answer.
Well, actually,
what you can do is increase the speed of evolution.
Well, and I think that's really well said, because it brings us to the very first statement we made, which is people saying we should be more like a startup. When I hear that, there is a risk, and I have seen it, that people go back and they start again.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't work. So anyway, thank you. Thank you, Gareth. This is another one of those episodes where there's a little bit of an idea there, and this is a chance for us to tease it out and see it. And I leave this episode looking forward to the next one, because it worries me. There's a huge gap in, I'm going to use the word efficiency, opportunity in businesses and military to go do this. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If this is the first time you've listened to us, we literally, myself and Gareth, message each other about new countries where there are people who have downloaded and listened to the podcast. If you are new to this podcast, we have now nearly 100 episodes for you to listen to. Please do download those episodes. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. So every Thursday you get your new episode of Battling with Business. If you were shouting at your podcasting device at some point, please do email us. We are on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We are on Twitter or X, Battling with Biz. I've ventured onto Blue Sky. Get this, Gareth, a place where it isn't a cesspool of hatred and anger.
Shall we commit now to moving on to Blue Sky?
Yes, I think we could. And actually, it's quite a refreshing place. Anyway, we will get there, and we'll be able to see you there as well. We hope you've enjoyed this. Please let us know if there's anything you want us to hear us talk about. If we get it wrong, we get it right. And look forward, as Gareth mentioned, we were just looking at our calendars. We shall be going to see the RAF at Cranwell in not too distant future. It's in the new year. But we will very much like to take you on that journey and hear what the RAF has to say about leadership. And we're also crossing our fingers. I'm sad to say the Navy is probably the last ones that we'll get to, but we are hopeful I get to go back to my old alma mater at Dartmouth before they potentially close it. There was a report they might close it, but I want to go back and walk into the senior gun room or salute the flag and all those good, exciting things. Thank you for joining us. We will see you again next week, where we will pick up where we left off, and we will talk more about stages of an organization. And thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.